Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I have been rereading, I should say, one of my all-time favorite books, which is Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's a super long book, but so good, so well-researched, incredible insight into how Abraham Lincoln built his cabinet by putting all of his rivals for the presidential nomination on it, as well as some Democrats, and held it together and eventually earned the respect of these men who actually thought they could have done a better job as president than he did. And it's such just a great look at that. And it was actually part of that book that the movie Lincoln was based on. So I feel like diving into a little Abraham Lincoln. So we're going to take a look at the channel Resyndicated, which we've looked at before. And I'll put the link in the description to this original content so you can go check out their channel and see all the other stuff that they have done. This one's called How Other Presidents Reacted to Abraham Lincoln's Death. So I'm pretty interested to see how this all is going to be put together. I have not read a lot of other presidents' reactions to Lincoln's death, a little bit here and there. I want to give a shout out to Joe in Dublin, Ireland. Can't wait to visit Dublin someday. And also Evan in Pasadena, California. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. And I want to let you guys know I am planning to visit the last episode of Useful Charts look at Christian denominations, as well as that latest Epic History TV video on Napoleon in Italy. So be watching for those later on in the next week or so. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, 3 former presidents were still alive, along with 11 future presidents. 13th President Millard Fillmore was the earliest president still living.
Alec Baldwin. John Tyler had died in 1862.
As word of Lincoln's death spread across the nation, citizens hung black drapes on their houses.
I know where this
is going. An expression of mourning. The former president's house had no such decorations.
It wasn't home.
An angry mob targeted Fillmore's house, splashing it with black ink. Fillmore often disagreed with Abraham Lincoln. They never battled directly in the political realm, as Fillmore had returned to private life in his post-presidency, but he did voice certain objections. Nevertheless, he supported the Union cause. He even commanded a militia where he lived in Buffalo, New York. Towards the war's end, he advocated for generosity towards the South, which put him at odds with the administration. The lack of mourning drapes, however, was not intentional. Fillmore was simply out of town when Lincoln was killed.
Now, this really, though, gives some insight into the mind of the country at this time, right? Remember, Abraham Lincoln, when he dies when he's reelected in 1864, he wins with about 55% of the popular vote, which is a pretty substantial margin. Like, if that happened today, we would consider that practically a landslide, and it was a landslide electorally. He destroyed McClellan in the Electoral College. But it was a closer election than one might think. And remember, this is only mostly the border and northern states that are even voting. So, he wasn't exactly universally supported in the North, but when he was assassinated, by the time he's assassinated, the war's over, or pretty much over, and he really is viewed differently. And they have this procession of funeral stops that take weeks as he kind of goes through the North, and there are funerals in every major city along the route. And he really is universally beloved by this point, and there's a backlash against anybody who is seen as not supportive of the president. And there's a backlash as well against the conspirators. If you ever want to see a good look at this, watch the movie The Conspirator, which kind of centers around the trial primarily of Mary Surratt. And you see how really there just was no attempt at a fair trial against these conspirators. People just wanted to see revenge happen. And so when Millard Fillmore is even slightly seen to have not displayed the proper degree of mourning for Abraham Lincoln, there's backlash, even though it turns out he wasn't even home.
An acquaintance who passed Fillmore in the streets noted he wore a badge of mourning and described the assassination as, quote, a great national calamity. He and his militia would escort Lincoln's funeral train when it passed through Buffalo.
Yeah, and Buffalo then is later on where William McKinley will be assassinated. Remember, this is the very first time a president has been murdered. There have been attempts, but never one that was successful.
Fillmore and Lincoln weren't particularly close, but seemed to have a friendly relationship. When Lincoln passed through Buffalo following his inauguration, Fillmore hosted him at his mansion and took him to church. During Lincoln's presidency, Fillmore wrote at least one letter to Lincoln asking for a favor for his nephew. Franklin Pierce was a Democrat and an outspoken critic of Lincoln and the war. Quote, "I never justify, sustain, or in any way or to any extent uphold this cruel, heartless, aimless, unnecessary war."
And you were pretty much one of our worst presidents ever. And we've talked about Pierce before. Pierce, even though he's a northerner, he's from New Hampshire, very much Southern in his sympathies. He's a very pro-slave state president when he's in office. Of course, during the Civil War, you have to remember that, we in our mindset today, we think of Democrats and Republicans as being kind of polar opposites on the political spectrum. It wasn't that way for most of history. Each party had wings within it, right? And so the Democrats had conservative Democrats, anti-war Democrats, but also pro-union, pro-war Democrats. You had pro-slavery Democrats, and you had much more kind of against the spread of slavery Democrats. Within the Republican Party, you have abolitionists, you have radicals who want not only abolition but full equality for black people after they're freed. But you also have conservative Republicans. You have pro-union, anti-union, you have pro-war, anti-war, kind of on all sides of this. I think, though, it does polarize a little more during the war.
War that, in his mind, was all Lincoln's fault. His positions cost him friendships and his reputation. His home in Concord, New Hampshire, like Fillmore's, wasn't draped in mourning. However, Pierce was fully aware of this. An angry mob descended on the former president's home. Pierce stepped outside and confronted them directly. Quote, "I wish I could address you words of solace, but that can hardly be done. The magnitude of the calamity in all aspects is overwhelming." When his patriotism was questioned due to his lack of mourning decorations, Pierce countered, quote, "It is not necessary for me to show my devotion for the Star and Stripes by any special exhibition, or upon the demand of any man or body of men. If the period during which I served our state in various situations commencing more than 35 years ago have left any question of my devotion to the flag, the Constitution, and the Union in doubt, it is too late now to remove it by any such exhibition as the inquiry suggests."
I get a lot of disagreements with Franklin Pierce, but I totally get what he's saying there, and I think that that's a reasonable way to explain yourself.
The service Pierce referred to was in the Mexican-American
He was a general.
War. He had served alongside Ulysses S. Grant. Despite their political differences, Grant affirmed Pierce's courage and devotion to his country. While
Grant's the kind of guy too that's pretty much always going to give people the benefit of the doubt. That's just kind of who he is, and that got him into some trouble over time because he would tend to be a little too naive about people who would take advantage of him because he always tended to try and give people the benefit of the doubt.
Generally in opposition to Lincoln, James Buchanan expressed grief in a letter to his former Postmaster General, Horatio King. Quote, "I feel the assassination of President Lincoln to be a terrible misfortune to our country." Buchanan reflected on his two meetings with Lincoln, once when Lincoln arrived in Washington, and then again on Lincoln's inauguration. His impression was that Lincoln was kind, benevolent, and with frank manners. He also claimed that he held him in high personal regard and never changed that opinion.
Yeah, there are interesting descriptions of their meetings, and at one point I think Buchanan is said to have told Lincoln, "If you are as happy on taking this office as I am on leaving it, then I consider you a very happy man." Like Buchanan was glad to be out of there, and he did not handle the secession crisis very well at all. But yeah, I've never read or heard of anything that Buchanan said during Lincoln's administration that leads me to think that Buchanan was trying to undermine or saw Lincoln's handling of the situation in any real negative way.
By this point, Buchanan had retreated to a quiet life in his home state of Pennsylvania.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Many Americans blamed him for the Civil War and even considered him a traitor. Therefore, he spent his final years reclusively. While he didn't act against the South when he was president, he supported the Union cause and seemed to harbor no ill feelings towards his successor.
That's true.
Listen,
Buchanan had a long, storied career before presidency. A lot of these guys, like John Adams, for example, James Buchanan, people who are not necessarily viewed as great presidents, nonetheless had really stellar careers before that. Buchanan, for example, is Secretary of State at one point. So some of these guys, their presidency is kind of the low point of their careers.
That Andrew Johnson didn't have a particularly close relationship with Lincoln. Another man, Hannibal Hamlin, had been Lincoln's vice president during his first term. Johnson was only Lincoln's vice president for a month and was chosen for purely political reasons.
Yeah, but makes total sense when you understand Lincoln and you understand his goals. Johnson is a war Democrat. He's one of that wing of the Democratic Party that's pro-union, pro-fighting the Civil War, even though he was also pro-slavery. He's from East Tennessee, which was pretty pro-union during the war. He stays loyal to the Union as a senator from Tennessee, becomes the war governor of Tennessee. And so when Lincoln was looking to do kind of a Union ticket as the war is winding down and he's looking to kind of unify the country, it makes sense he would put a war Democrat on the ticket with him.
Nevertheless, he reacted with rage after learning of the shooting. He was awoke in the middle of the night and immediately headed to Lincoln's bedside.
Not immediately. My understanding is that there were some other things that were taken care of first, and they had to secure him too. Remember, Andrew Johnson had actually been a target, and it was a conspiracy. You had an attack on William Seward, the Secretary of State, that was nearly successful. The guy goes in and he tries to fire at Seward had been injured in a carriage accident, was wearing like a neck brace and stuff, and there was all this metal around his head. His son was sitting outside his room, and when the assassin came in, he tried to fire at the son, and the gun misfired. So then he beats the son. He goes in with a knife, and he stabs somebody at the bedside. He stabs Seward like 5 times, but the neck brace protected him from any serious wounds. The assassin who was supposed to kill Johnson just had a few drinks and then chickened out. And didn't go after him. And they were also supposed to go after Grant, who was supposed to attend Ford's Theater with Lincoln that night.
Afterwards, a military guard witnessed Johnson pacing back and forth, stating, quote, "They shall suffer for this. They shall suffer for this."
I believe he was genuine in that.
Upon seeing Johnson again, Grant noted his anger. Quote, "He seemed to be anxious to get at the leaders to punish them," Grant wrote. He would say that the leaders of the rebellion must be punished and that treason be made odious.
He backed off of that after time, though. He was pretty generous to the former Confederacy in his administration.
Booth shot Lincoln shortly after 10 p.m. Earlier that day, Johnson and Lincoln had met for the final time to discuss Reconstruction. Ulysses S. Grant had a closer relationship with Lincoln than any of the other presidents.
Yep.
Though they came from different backgrounds, with Grant not having much interest in politics.
This has always been one of my favorite pictures of Grant. It was taken during the war, and just fantastic. Grant, there was actually, by the spring of 1864, you have to understand that it had become the norm that people were one-term presidents. The idea of a 2-term president was pretty rare in the years leading up to the Civil War. And so it was no foregone conclusion that Lincoln was going to win re-election or that he would even get the nomination. And there was concern from Lincoln and from the leadership of the Republican Party about whether or not Grant might be interested in running. He had become popular enough that there were questions about might the Democrats reach out to Grant. They end up nominating another general in McClellan. But Grant had won success on the battlefield, and there was concern that maybe even the Republicans might want to nominate Grant. And Grant reassured the president he had no interest in any of that.
The two developed a mutual respect over the war. Some in the military castigated Grant as an inept drunk. Attacks from the press became so vicious that Grant even considered resigning. But Lincoln saw him as invaluable and repeatedly defended him.
Yep.
Quote, "I can't spare this man.
He fights.
In a letter written to Grant in January 1865, he even addressed Grant as a friend. At Lincoln's funeral, Grant stood alone, openly sobbing.
Yep.
He would later describe Lincoln as, quote, "the greatest man I have ever known."
Incontestably, the greatest man I have ever known. And for Grant to say that, it means something. Grant did not have a ton of interaction with Lincoln. And he didn't even support Lincoln in the 1860 election. He couldn't vote. He wasn't eligible to vote because he had just moved to Galena, Illinois, not long before that, and hadn't established himself to be able to vote, I don't think. But I know he supported the Democrat. I want to say either Stephen Douglas or John Bell. He said had he voted, it wouldn't have been for Lincoln.
Grant was supposed to be Lincoln's guest of honor on the night of the assassination, and was in fact one of Booth's targets. However, he had declined Lincoln's invitation as he had planned to visit in-laws. Rutherford B. Hayes' thoughts are recorded in a letter written shortly after the assassination to his wife, Lucy. Quote, "When I heard first yesterday morning of the awful tragedy at Washington, I was pained and shocked to a degree I have never before experienced. The probable consequences, or rather the possible results in their worst imaginable form, were presented to my mind one after the other, until I really began to feel that there was a calamity so extensive that in no direction could be found the slightest glimmer of consolation." Wow. He did, however, take solace in knowing that Lincoln would be remembered as a martyr. Then Congressman James A. Garfield said of the assassination.
So Garfield's interesting. Before he gets into what he said, Garfield had been a general, as was Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes and McKinley served together in the 23rd Ohio. Hayes was actually wounded just before the Battle of Antietam. Garfield leads troops in the Western Theater in Kentucky, other places, serves as a staff officer, but then goes home to run for Congress and ends up in Congress. And so he's in Congress, for example, when they vote on the 23rd or on the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, and did not speak particularly well of Lincoln while he was a congressman. Don't get the impression Garfield thought too highly of Lincoln.
Quote, "It was no man who killed Abraham Lincoln.
No one man who killed Lincoln.
It was the embodied spirit of treason and slavery, inspired with fearful and despairing hate, that struck him down in the moment of the nation's supremest joy." In prior interactions, however, Garfield had less kind things to say about Lincoln. Though the two Republicans fought on the same side, they were often on different sides of factional divides.
Right.
Whereas Millard Fillmore was concerned that Lincoln would treat the South too harshly, Garfield was the opposite. A young and passionate radical Republican, Garfield thought that Lincoln was far too merciful.
Yeah, see, and this is the thing, this is one of the reasons why Lincoln was such a masterful politician. And I'm saying masterful as in best politician ever as president. No president has ever been as good as Lincoln was at being practical and bringing sides together and holding a really disparate coalition together. I mean, he had his radical Republicans to deal with who viewed Lincoln as way too conservative, and the conservatives who thought Lincoln was way too radical, and somehow he made it work. And so, yeah, the radicals felt like Lincoln moved way too slowly on things. The conservatives thought Lincoln was going way too fast on things. And Lincoln found a way to go at just the right speed. A great example of this is you see the probably fictional interaction in the movie Lincoln between Abraham Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens, played by Tommy Lee Jones, where Lincoln's trying to get the radical Stevens to back off a little bit. And he tells him, he said, you know, if I had listened to you, I would have freed the slaves the minute the South fired on Fort Sumter. And instead of being able to pass the 13th Amendment and abolish slavery, as we hope to do in a few days, we would have watched helpless as infants as it spread from the American South into South America. And it was Lincoln's way of saying, listen, it's not that I didn't support the idea of abolition. I just understood we weren't in that place to do it practically. And the radicals just couldn't understand Lincoln's hesitancy to move faster.
Quote, "He'll probably be the man, but I think we could do better," he said of Lincoln during the 1864 election. There was perhaps even some personal animosity, as he'd refer to Lincoln as a second-rate lawyer. After Lincoln's assassination, riots broke out in the streets. Garfield delivered an impromptu speech to quiet the crowd. Curiously, at no point did he mention Lincoln by name. As Garfield aged, he reflected on Lincoln more positively. Quote, "He was the only great ruler whose wisdom grew with his power." As for later presidents, less is known about their reaction to Lincoln's death. It doesn't seem as though the reaction from Chester A. Arthur or Grover Cleveland was ever recorded.
So, interesting, I want to go back and take a look at who we're talking about, because let's understand here, right? Theodore Roosevelt is a little kid. I mean, he's a young man. He's like 6, 7 years old at the time. Same with Woodrow Wilson. He's very young. Probably didn't view Lincoln's death with any great sense of mourning. I'm sure Wilson's family probably were fine with it. But Roosevelt, there is this incredible picture of Theodore Roosevelt and his brother looking at the procession as Lincoln's funeral goes by.
Less is known about their reaction to Lincoln's death. It doesn't seem as though the reaction from Chester A. Arthur or Grover Cleveland was ever recorded. However, it is known that a 27-year-old Grover Cleveland attended Lincoln's funeral. Benjamin Harrison was a fellow Republican who campaigned for Lincoln. Prior to the war, he had made 80 speeches endorsing Lincoln while he worked as a lawyer. He had written to Lincoln at least once asking for an appointment of his personal friend and former Congressman William Comeback to paymaster in the Army.
Interesting, paymaster in the Army was actually a position that Lincoln, before the war, or right as the war was beginning, offered to his brother-in-law, Benjamin Hardin Helm, who would go on to be a Confederate general who was killed later in the war. He was married to Mary Lincoln's sister.
Harrison served as a colonel in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was reuniting with his old regiment when he got the news of the assassination. William McKinley also served in the Union Army. However, at the age of 22 and the rank of major, he was hardly a figure on the national stage. Thus, his reaction wasn't recorded. Theodore Roosevelt was only 6 years old when Lincoln was killed. This photo of Lincoln's funeral procession features Theodore along with his brother Elliot as they watched from a second-story window. William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson were only 7 and 6 years old, respectively. To support regular uploads from this channel...
All right, that was pretty cool. I like how he just kind of brought some information together that maybe we didn't otherwise know, and we were able to kind of get their views on some things. So if you have other videos of his that you'd like me to check out, let me know in the comment section below, and we'll do some more down the road. I want to give a shout out to Ryan, and I'm going to butcher this name, but I'm going to try really hard. Mamaroneck, New York. Tell me if I got it wrong. And Trish in Wagga Wagga in Australia, New South Wales. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Check out some of the links to some other videos here. Thanks for watching.